Retroid always generates a lot of hype when they announce a new device, and with pretty good reason. They usually end up making a good handheld with really good performance at a pretty reasonable price. Sure, there's usually some type of issue with launch, but they normally take care of things and before long, it becomes the go-to handheld for a lot of people. So of course, when the RP Mini got announced, people got pretty excited. A small, powerful device with a 4x3 AMOLED screen sounds pretty awesome. But is this little guy worth the hype? Let's talk about it. Full disclosure, Retro sent this unit in for a review, but they haven't seen this video and all opinions are my own. That being said, let's look at the price and the specs. The RP Mini retails for $199 USD and runs on Android 10, with updates for Android 13 and Linux coming later on in October. Here's what you get with it: a Snapdragon 865 with an Adreno 650 GPU, 128GB of internal storage, which can be expanded with a microSD card, a 3.7-inch AMOLED screen with a resolution of 1280 by 960 at 60Hz, more on that later, a 4000 mAh battery with active cooling, Wi-Fi 6, Bluetooth 5.1, a 3.5mm headphone jack, and video out over USB-C. Next up, let's talk about battery life, and I'm still trying to figure out what the best way to gauge this is, but hopefully what I have gives you a clear idea. I ran some tests with 5 different games, Wi-Fi on and screen brightness at 50%, and here's what I got. Starting off with something easy, for GBA I played Final Fantasy VI in standard mode with the fan off. After an hour of gameplay, I saw a 6% drop in battery life. Moving up a little bit with Dreamcast playing Sonic Adventure at a 2x resolution in standard mode with the fan on smart mode, I lost 6% battery and the fan never kicked on. For PSP, playing God of War Chains of Olympus at a 3x resolution with the fan on smart mode, I lost 10% battery after 1 hour. For the Gamecube, playing Wind Waker at a 2x resolution in performance mode with the fan on smart, I lost 12% after an hour. And finally, for the PS2, playing Jak and Daxter at a 2x resolution in high performance mode with the fan on smart mode, I lost 22% battery life after 1 hour. I set the performance profile for each game so that I wasn't going to get any performance issues. Now for Jak and Daxter, I probably could have set it to smart instead of sports mode, but still, with lighter to emulate games, you should be able to get well over 10 hours, and with the more demanding stuff, 3.5 to 4 hours. That's a lot better than I thought we were going to get with a 4000 mAh battery and this chip. Now let's look at some performance benchmarks, and for this testing I used Geekbench for CPU and GPU in both Vulkan and OpenCL, as well as 3D Mark's Wildlife. I'm going to be comparing the results to the Galaxy S20 since that also has an 865 in it, and I want to know how an older flagship phone is going to compare to a handheld using the same chip. I'm also going to be using the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro because that is Retroid's previous flagship, and at least on paper, the D1100 is very similar to the 865 in the new Mini and the upcoming Retroid Pocket 5. First up, we have Geekbench 6, and I know there's a lot happening in this chart, so let's focus on some key points, but feel free to pause if you want to check out all the numbers. In the CPU test for single core performance, the RP Mini outperforms both the S20 and the 4 Pro across all 3 settings. That's really good because single core performance is usually much more important for emulation. In terms of multi-core performance, the RP Mini only wins in the standard powered mode because as we increase the power for the RP4 Pro, the gap just widens. However, multi-core performance isn't as crucial for emulation, so it's not a huge loss. Now, when we look at the GPU benchmarks in both Vulkan and OpenCL, the 4 Pro takes it by a significant margin, but that's not necessarily going to reflect in actual gameplay, as we'll see up next. When we look at the Wildlife test, the RP Mini comes out on top across all 3 settings, and this is what I meant by the previous GPU benchmark not telling the whole story. At the bottom, we have 2 more charts showing the Wildlife stress test results. The first one displays the best and worst loop scores, while the second one shows the stability results. Just like with the other tests, the stock 865 falls behind significantly, but maintains a solid performance with a 92.7 stability score. The Mini, without the fan, did not hold up well, landing at a 74.6% stability score. However, once I turned the fan on to the smart setting, it outperformed the 4 Pro across all 3 performance settings. One thing to note is that the throttling only happened during the stress test, but playing less demanding games without the fan didn't cause any issues. Plus, even with the fan running in smart mode, it never really gets loud enough to bother me. So, some key takeaways from this is that a phone with an 865 is not going to perform the same as a handheld with dedicated cooling. The Mini has better single core performance than both the 865 stock and the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro, which that is going to have a bigger impact for the emulation. And even though the 4 Pro beats it in GPU testing, it does not perform better than the Mini in any of the 3D Mark Wildlife tests or in actual gameplay, even though on paper they look to be very similar. Now let's talk about the hardware and ergonomics, and I got the all black. Personally, I think this is the best one you can get. The screen blends seamlessly into the rest of the device, so if you're playing something with black bars like GBA, they're pretty much going to disappear. In terms of size, it's really similar to the 2S, just a bit wider and thicker at the bottom due to the bumps. If you're not familiar with these emulation handhelds, think of it as being about the size of a PSP. Compared to the 4 Pro, it's smaller, but the bumps give it a more comfortable grip. Ergonomically, it feels really good. The bumps add a lot of comfort without making it too bulky, and the curved design makes it really easy to use the bumpers and triggers. I'd say it's probably the most comfortable small handheld I've ever used, but I really wouldn't call it a mini because I don't think this is in the same size category as the Miyoo Mini or the 28XX. Now let's look at the controllers. I'm a fan of the D-pad being up top, so I'm really happy with this placement. The D-pad looks similar to the clicky one Retroid has used in the past, but it feels a little bit tighter this time. It doesn't pivot as much. If you press the middle, you can actually hit all 4 directions, which isn't ideal in my opinion. Still, it's a solid D-pad, no accidental inputs, and I had no issues pulling off moves in fighting games. It just feels a little bit different than what I'm used to from Retroid. If you prefer the stick up top and aren't happy with this layout, let me just say, both are very comfortable to use. The analog sticks are great, they're the usual Retroid style that we've come to expect. They have a nice range of motion and no snapping. I did, however, notice a tiny dead zone in the corners when using the gamepad tester, but it's not something I picked up when playing any games. The face buttons are probably the only thing that I'm not totally in love with. They have a good travel, the materials feel fine, but they're a bit loud and flatter than I'd like. They also scratch when you're using them, but that's pretty normal with a hard shell surface like glass or metal. But that should go away with use, so it's not a big deal. But in my opinion, the white letters on the black buttons take away from the premium look. I think black buttons with colored letters would have been way better, but I'm just nitpicking. One change that I am really happy to see is that we finally have Start and Select at the top of the front of the device, while still keeping the home and back buttons at the bottom. In the front, we also have 2 front-facing speakers that sound pretty good. They get pretty loud without distorting, which is nice. Here's a quick test, so please adjust your volume accordingly because it's gonna get loud. The sound is clear, and while I don't think most people are going to be cranking the speakers to max, it's still good to know that you can if you want to. These aren't the best speakers I've heard on a handheld, but they're definitely good. Okay, let's talk about the screen, and this is probably the biggest highlight. Sure, it's on the smaller size, but having an OLED screen on a device this size with this aspect ratio is pretty amazing. I've seen some people criticizing that it's not 4 inches, and I completely get that, but the color quality and resolution do a lot to make up for it. It's a 60Hz panel, and according to the UFO test, it holds steady at that. I also didn't notice any ghosting, which I guess is what you would expect with an OLED panel. The only issue I've had is sometimes it won't let me swipe up or down to exit games unless I swipe to the left. It's not affecting gameplay, but it is a little bit weird. I'm not sure if it's just my unit or just generally how the device behaves, but it's worth mentioning. All that said, with the resolution of 1280 by 960, everything looks sharp and the colors really pop. As of right now, I think this is the best screen on a small device. Now, the last hardware component I want to talk about is going to be the fan. In sports mode, you're definitely going to hear it, but if you set it to quiet or smart, it's really not a problem. Smart mode does a good job of keeping temperature stable without ramping up too much, and the quiet mode is, well, pretty quiet. Retroid has made adjustments to the fan speed in the past, so I'm sure we'll see that again, especially because the current sports mode, in my opinion, is way more than what's necessary. Alright, let's talk about the software, and I'm really not going to spend a lot of time on this because things are going to be changing. Retroid is currently working on an Android 13 upgrade, a new launcher, and support for Batocera. So let's look at what we have for now. As usual, the Android 10 build is going to be pretty clean with no bloat, and if you don't feel like hunting down emulators, the setup wizard can get you started with a bunch of pre-installed options. Personally, I like to install everything myself, but it's nice that the option is there if you don't want to do that. From the drop-down menu, you can change things like controller type, fan speed, performance mode, LED lights, and even turn on the floating icon to use the screen mapper or check real-time stats like FPS, RAM usage, and temperatures. There's also the option to use the current Retroid launcher, which is fine if you don't want to install any third-party launchers. It does a decent job of consoleizing the whole experience. That said, with the update on the way, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on how to set this up. Personally, I just launch my games from the home screen and call it a day. Now, one area that still needs a lot of work is the docking experience. If you're using the launcher and playing systems that run on RetroArch, it's fine, but playing standalone emulators can be a bit of a hassle to set up, and everything seems to scale to a 4x3 screen, even when playing widescreen content. This is where I think Batocera is really going to come in and improve the docking experience for people that actually want to use that. But we'll have to wait and see how that turns out. Right now, it's okay, but it could definitely be better. Alright, now let's talk about some games, and since this is an Android device, I think that's a pretty good place to start. Most Android games are going to run at high settings, 60 FPS, and a lot of them scale really nicely to a 4x3 screen, so they're going to look really good. Plus, with the controllers being recognized as an Xbox controller, you're going to get native support in a bunch of games. Another cool thing is that with the active cooling, you don't really have to worry about performance drops, even on really long play sessions. Personally, I like to use Vita caps on the thumbsticks to give them a little bit extra height when playing games like Call of Duty. It makes aiming feel a lot smoother to me. And I know the screen isn't really ideal for Android games, but they still look really good even though it's a smaller display. As cool as Android games are, we both know that's not the reason you're getting a handheld like this, so let's talk about what really matters: emulation. To keep this section short, I'll just say that pretty much every system older than the PlayStation 2 and Gamecube runs beautifully with minimal fuss, even on the standard power profile without the fan. Plus, since it has a 4x3 screen, everything scales perfectly. Super Nintendo, Genesis, PlayStation 1, N64, Dreamcast, all of those systems look awesome on this little guy. Now, when it comes to PSP, it's a little bit more complicated. Performance-wise, it's fantastic, but I know for a lot of people, the screen might feel a little too small, and that's totally understandable. Personally, I've spent a lot of time playing NCAA Football 07 on other handhelds with a 3.5-inch screen, so it's not really a deal breaker for me, but if the screen size doesn't bother you, the Mini will play pretty much any PSP game you throw at it. One system I want to give special mention to is the Saturn. People have been wanting a small handheld that can handle Saturn emulation for a while now, and if you're familiar with the scene, you know Saturn is notoriously tricky to emulate. I'm personally not a huge Saturn fan, so I'm not super familiar with the library, but everything I tested worked fine. Even though the button layout isn't ideal, the power of the 865 chip means that you're going to be able to enjoy your favorite Saturn games as long as they're compatible with the emulator. Moving on to something a bit more modern, we have the 3DS. This one's interesting because the original 3DS screen isn't too far off from the minis, so display-wise it can kind of work, but the challenge comes with the bottom screen. Luckily, the screen was mostly used for menus, so you could switch back and forth and kind of make it work. But don't get me wrong, 3DS is definitely a compromised experience. However, the performance is there to play most things upscaled outside of the shader compilation stutters, which do go away the more you play. It just depends how much you're willing to work around the screen size. Moving on to Gamecube, I think this is one of the main reasons to get this handheld. If you're mostly into first-party games like Mario or Zelda, you shouldn't have any issues. The same goes for a lot of third-party titles. Most of them are going to run just fine, upscaled to 2x resolution. The 865 chip in here has plenty of power for most of the Gamecube library, but it's not going to be flawless for everything. Some third-party games like Need for Speed Most Wanted or Baldur's Gate Dark Alliance might give you some trouble. They're still pretty playable if you're willing to lower the emulated CPU speed or try some Dolphin forks, but I like to use the mainline dev build, so that's where my experience is coming from. Wii is a similar story. The bigger challenge with Wii games is mapping the Wiimote, which can be a serious pain. I usually just recommend people stick with the games that support the classic controller or check online for some tips on setting up motion controls. If you can do that, you're going to have a good time. Both GameCube and Wii games should run at about 2 to 3x resolution, just be prepared to tweak the settings every now and then. Up next, let's look at the PlayStation 2, which is the other big selling point for the Mini. Personally, I like using Nether SX2 Classic because it normally runs on lower power devices, so it's going to give me more overhead. Most games I tested worked fine, but I did have to tweak a couple settings, like turning on textures inside RT to fix some graphical glitches. But overall, the device handles PS2 games pretty well. Just keep in mind though that PS2 emulation on Android isn't flawless, so some games will have issues, but that's more about the emulator's compatibility versus the device's power. Still, the Mini can handle most PS2 games that Android can currently support. Okay, finally, let's talk about the Switch. And honestly, the Mini screen isn't going to be the best for playing Switch games, and with it still on Android 10, compatibility is not where it could be. I do expect things to get better once we get Android 13, but we'll see how that goes. Right now, Switch emulation is okay, but not great. That said, I've noticed that performance is better than what I got with the 4 Pro thanks to the Snapdragon chip and custom drivers. If you just want something to play some indie games, maybe some 2D platformers, or just catch some monsters, it'll get the job done, but Switch should not be one of the reasons you pick something like this up. Honestly, I was not expecting to like the Mini as much as I do, simply because the 2S didn't really do it for me. I loved the design, the look of it, everything, but for some reason I just couldn't get into it, so I felt like this was going to be more of the same. And then we got the Retroid Pocket 5 announcement, and I was way more hyped for that one. But After spending some time with the Mini, I think it's an awesome little machine with a lot to offer, and it's only going to get better. Retroid is usually really good about software updates, so I'm excited to see where this goes. If you're in the market for a smaller 4x3 device, then you can't really go wrong with this one. Sure, it's not as budget friendly as some other options if you just want to play older retro games, but you definitely get what you pay for here. You have an AMOLED screen, you have great compatibility with PlayStation 2 and Gamecube, and it's going to easily fit in your pocket. Honestly, at this size, you can't really go wrong. But keep in mind, the Retroid Pocket 5 is coming, and if you like what the Mini's doing, but you feel like that screen is just a little bit too small, then maybe the 5 is the one to get for you. But what do you think? Are you going to be picking this one up? Are you going to wait for the 5? Did you already grab one? What color did you get? Let me know down in the comments below. I appreciate you hanging out, and I'll see you on the next one.